I will be going over the installation of a Gate MERF 3.2 Mosfet into my ICS L86A2 LSW. I will also be running new wire for this build. I'm salvaging this Mosfet from my old V2 primary that I just upgraded to a Gate Titan. A new MERF Mosfet should come with everything you need, which includes the Mosfet, dual signal wire, DNS connectors, wire shrink tube, and motor wire connectors. First, grab all the pieces you need. For the motor connectors, make sure you have the 90-degree ones to suit the wire run and motor position of the L86. I'm going to assume that you know how to tear down your gun, and we'll start with the upper and lower separated and the gearbox out. If you don't know these steps already, check out my unboxing and teardown video for the L86. Open the handguard and remove the hidden bolt that secures the fixed handguard half. Push in and remove the gas tube. I plan to set the Mosfet in the handguard due to space constraints and the size of the MERF Mosfet. It's actually pretty bulky and long. Flip the gun over and remove the screw at the base. Undo the flash hider so that you can slip the barrel out of the handguard system. Remove the inner barrel and set that aside. Remove the two screws securing the base plate that clamps the rear of the barrel in place. I like to keep all my screws together with the parts that I removed them from, that way you avoid losing any screws. Loosen the front two screws, which also clamp the barrel down, and slide the barrel out. Remove the three screws for the wire protection plate and slide the charging handle back so that you can remove the actual plate itself. All this removal will expose the majority of the wiring run. Finally, remove the four screws for the barrel mount block at the rear. Now, this will fully expose your wiring. Slip the wiring out of the retention clip and undo the stock trigger unit screw. With the trigger unit now removed, you can remove the stock wiring completely with it. Pop the wires off the trigger pins. We will be completely replacing the entirety of the wiring with new modified low resistance wiring. Also, the dual signal wire will actually get soldered directly to the trigger unit rather than the power wires themselves. There are a few ways you can measure your wiring out, but I think the simplest way is to measure it as it's strung along the existing wiring harness. If you relocate the Mosfet, then you may need to check wiring length another way. I'm going to make sure to only rough cut the wire length for now, leaving a little bit extra. As I cut the wiring, I'll slip on red and black heat shrink tube just to keep track of which wires were measured for which location in case they're a little bit different. They should actually be pretty close. Next, we need to measure the length of the dual signal wire. The dual signal wire will be soldered directly to the trigger posts. This means the trigger mechanism will only serve to connect the signal line, which is a lot lower amperage, offering additional protection to prevent burnout of trigger contacts. To measure the signal wire length, I'll set the trigger unit in place within the upper and confirm against the existing wire harness how long the signal wire needs to be to get the ideal placement position for my Mosfet. Also to note, the signal wire is much lower gauge and more sensitive to damage, so if the signal wire is a little bit longer than your power wires, I think that's preferable. This way, if your Mosfet ever accidentally gets yanked out, it'll put the strain on the power wires initially, and the signal wire will have at least a little bit of slack before it gets pulled too. Hopefully you notice you're pulling it by then and you can prevent that. Now that all the wiring is run for rough length, strip the signal wire and strip one end of the power wires. On the main power wires, wire crimp on the 90-degree motor connectors and heat shrink tube, black or red, as far around the 90-degree connector as you can pull the heat shrink. Now we move on to installing the signal wire. You have to split the trigger unit in half. Start by opening the screw, then gently pry the two halves of the plastic shell of the trigger unit apart. I'm going to clean off the trigger contacts with a bit of rubbing alcohol. For some reason, right from the factory, they had a ton of grease on them. Next, onto soldering. I'm going to pre-tin and solder the trigger wires directly to the trigger pins. Don't forget to slip a bit of heat shrink tube down the wiring before soldering. The heat shrink tube here can just be black or whatever color you have, as it's not polarity sensitive. We apply heat shrink tubing over for a nice clean finish and to protect against possible shorts. Reinstall the trigger posts into the trigger unit by slipping them through the front half of the plastic shell, and then reseat it properly with the trigger post on the spring within the trigger unit. Test the spring action and rebound to make sure your heat shrink or solder job didn't cause any issues with fit. Screw the two halves of the trigger unit back together after clamping them. Resecure the trigger unit with the mounting screw into the upper while routing your trigger contact wire out the front and into the handguard area. Next, check out what side the red and black wires run for the motor and ensure to set the wiring correctly. Right now I'm going to slip a bunch of loose heat shrink tubing on my power wires so that I can secure them together along the body of the gun and not have two loose wires running down the length of my gun. Don't apply heat shrink the tubing yet until you've adjusted the wire length properly. Start by loose tucking the wiring in place underneath the wiring clip and underneath the trigger unit. Make sure to project the wiring into the handguard and then run heat shrink tube over the trigger wire and two power wires to keep them held together. Continue to loose fit the wires from front to back, making sure that they all run neatly side by side with the red and black on the appropriate side to match the motor. Install and roughly hold in place the gearbox. Route the wires up the back and secure them to the motor. Make sure the rear retainer pin can clear the positioning of your wires and bend the wiring appropriately to ensure good fit at the back end. With the wires attached to the motor, with the motor and gearbox installed loosely into the upper receiver, you can accurately confirm the wire length remaining or the length coming out into the handguard area. Now that I've checked the wire length and position of my power wire relative to my signal wire, I'll heat shrink everything together now. Go back through the length of the wire and apply heat to the heat shrink tubing along the full length. I like to slide the heat shrink tubing over any areas that I think will be pinch points in the future. This includes the area under the wire routing clip and also the area under the wire protection plastic guard. Now you can reinstall the plastic wire protection plate by sliding the charging handle back to slip it in place. You want to check the charging handle operation to make sure your wiring or heat shrink didn't cause any abnormal fit or bulge issues. Secure it with all three screws. Next, move to reinstall the barrel and the rear barrel centering and retaining devices. We can install the front handguard assembly again. Start by tightening the flash hider. Install the removable gas tube. Flip the gun over and install the bottom post screw. Finally, install the long bolt through to secure the fixed handguard half and sling plate together. Don't forget to tighten the 2 screws at the front end of the barrel that we loosened earlier. This will really secure the barrel in place. Now we can confirm the Mosfet position within the handguard, and we can cut the power wiring to final length. Set the Mosfet in position in the handguard and confirm how you want to bend or route your wires to suit your battery needs. Cut and strip the power wires. I want to leave my signal wire line a little bit longer compared to the power wires as mentioned earlier. You can also double check the wire length now, again by loose fitting the original wires and positioning your Mosfet in place beside this. For my Mosfet positioning, I want the tip of my Mosfet to come out as far as the original wiring did. That means my power wires will have to be cut back based on the length of the Mosfet. If you're like me and forgot now which wire is positive or negative, you can simply get a multimeter out and check for continuity. Make sure now to mark the wiring appropriately, or do this beforehand and you can skip this step. You really want to make sure that you don't mess up the polarity of your wiring. Next, we move on to soldering the Dean's connectors onto the power wire, coming out into the handguard. When I soldered Dean's, I was told by a friend and found it very helpful to insert both male and female Dean's ends together so that the Dean's T-plugs don't deform or move relative to one another after being heated up. What can happen is the metal of the T-plug can heat up too hot from soldering, which will then start to melt the plastic housing, and that causes it to deform the T-shape a little bit. Pre-tinning and trying not to apply too much heat to the metal plug are helpful to prevent this. Before you solder, don't forget to slip on a heat shrink tube of the appropriate color to protect the solder connection from shorts. I've already checked, and there's ample room for an 11.1 volt triple butterfly battery in the handguard even with the MERF Mosfet installed. With the Dean's wiring complete, plug in the Mosfet and signal line. Confirm that the wiring and Mosfet fit by closing the handguard. As you close the handguard, do so slowly for the first time to watch for any possible pinch points in the wiring. With my chosen wiring route, which is near the top of the gun, I noticed that the wiring comes fairly close to the top edge and the corner of the handguard as it closes. So what I did was I bent over the sharp metal edge on the top of the handguard, and I also zip tied my wiring to the bottom end of the gas tube line. This is pretty much it for the Mosfet and wiring installation. The next step is to fully assemble the gun with all the components and test with the battery and a magazine for a live fire test. Be sure to go through all the programmable settings and add any desired features. You can find the user guide for the MERF Mosfet on the manufacturer's website. For this build, I set the Mosfet to detect 11.1 volt LiPo, and I also kept it on the typical safe semi-full auto settings. I have also completed a bunch of other upgrades to the gun, which I'll overview in a separate video. The other upgrades are what really give the performance boost in terms of FPS and rate of fire. With that said, these Chrono results are independent of the work shown in this video, but the gun is shooting about 440 FPS on 0.2 gram BBs or 350 FPS on 0.3 gram BBs using the adjustable spring on the medium or M setting.